Greeting and welcomes to our series of weekly devotionals. This week we're looking at some verses from chapter 5 of Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. And I've said before, I've shared with my wife my assertion that if men were required to give birth, the human race would probably come to an end. I don't think men have the capacity to endure the pains that childbirth brings, so I give great kudos and admiration to women for going through that process of birth. It is not easy. And I bring that up because of the verse in this passage from Paul to the Thessalonians where he writes, "When they say there is peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape from the pain and the hardship and the challenge." This is a bit of a challenging verse because I think normally when we think of the coming of Christ, I mentioned yesterday, we normally think of it either as the coming of Jesus on Christmas Day, the little baby Jesus, which is a very warm and fuzzy story that we share every Advent and every Christmas. Or we think of it as the second coming of Jesus, in which case Jesus will come, make everything right, bring paradise on earth. Both of these sort of ways of thinking about the coming of Christ are comforting thoughts, and so it's a little bit perhaps disturbing for us to think of the coming of Jesus to be as painful as labor pains. But Paul in this verse also talks about peace and security. And it's interesting that Paul was writing in the same historical period of time that Jesus lived in within the Roman Empire, a period of time called the Pax Romana, otherwise known as the Roman peace. And it's a little bit misleading because the Romans maintained that era of peace through violence, through the suppression of any opposition. The peace existed for those who were privileged, but for most of the population, there was no real peace, for they lived in a period of oppression and injustice. And the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once said, quoting the prophets, they say peace, peace when there is no peace. And of course, he was talking about the reality that peace is not just the absence of conflict and violence, but it is the presence of justice for all people. And sometimes I think the Christians are called to understand that sometimes the work for justice can be disruptive and challenging and hard and painful. As the late Congressman John Lewis once said, we are called sometimes to stir up some good trouble. Certainly, Jesus stirred up some good trouble within the Roman Empire. It is what indeed got him executed. Certainly the prophets in the Hebrew Scriptures knew this as well, that sometimes the call to work for God's vision of justice is a disruptive one, a challenging one. Certainly as the months of this past summer have gone on, and we have seen many of the protests and some of the conflict that our country, our society has endured, we know this to be true, that the work for real peace and justice sometimes requires us to stir up some good trouble, to endure some pain and hardship. One of the things, though, that I believe women will probably tell you, I can't say this out of personal experience, but although labor pains are indeed painful and challenging and hard to endure, that one of the things that makes them tolerable is the knowledge that they are accompanied by new life. And certainly Paul, throughout his writings, writes often about the need to sacrifice with Christ, but also accompanying that, being raised to new life with Christ. And that is the message for all of us as we work toward a real vision of peace and justice. We know that we are working toward the kind of resurrected life that Jesus invites us into, that God desires for all people. There's a a famous adage about the gospel that I think is appropriate, that the gospel does not just comfort the afflicted, which is certainly true. It comforts us in our time of affliction, but the gospel message also afflicts the comfortable. And sometimes we need to hear that message as well to work for peace and justice. That is truly what the coming of Christ into our world, into our lives, is meant to call us toward. Amen.